Engagers, this is Professor Game, where we interview successful practitioners of games, gamification, and game thinking who bring us the best of their experiences to get ideas, insights, and inspiration to help us in the process of using games and gamification in our daily lives, for example, to learn what we are teaching. And I am Rob Alvarez. I work at IronHack, teach at IE Business School University, and so much more, and host this podcast. If you have an extra second, please go ahead and subscribe for free to our email list at professorgame.com/subscribe. Hey Engagers, welcome back to another episode of the Professor Game podcast. And we have today Mathew with us. But Mathew, before we take off, are you prepared to engage?
All set. Game on.
Let's do this because we have today with us Mathew Georghiou. Does that sound right?
Georghiou is what I say, although that's not quite the correct spelling, but I say it that way, a pronunciation, to make it easy for people.
Fantastic. So Georghiou is an engineer, inventor, designer, writer, and entrepreneur. He's a creator of GoVenture, which is one of the original and most widely used series of educational games and simulations in the world. His educational programs have reached millions of people around the world through thousands of schools, nonprofits, government agencies, and Fortune 500 companies. And he's also the founder of several companies, author of 2 books, and recently launched the world's first and only fully games-based training that offers a faster and more inspiring alternative to college business school. So Mathew, is there anything we're missing from that intro that you'd like to highlight?
That was pretty thorough. Thank you.
Amazing. So Mathew, what does a regular day with you look like? We want to sort of be in your shoes for a bit and understand, what does this whole thing feel like?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a late person. I'm usually up 1 or 2 a.m. working, designing something. So I'm usually in bed until about 9-ish, try to get to work by 10:30. I go right to work. I don't, no coffee, no breakfast, no nothing. Go get right to work, start checking my emails. I've been spending a fair bit of time on LinkedIn these days and sharing a lot of my experience there. So I'll check LinkedIn, maybe post something. I've got a newsletter I'll write a little bit about. I like writing early in the morning. I find if I have to do some writing, my mind is more clear early in the morning. I'll review our customer support tickets. So I review all the customer support that comes in because that helps me really understand areas that we may be able to improve, whether it's in our communications with our customers or design of our products. And then I work on so many different things, like so many projects from our games and simulations to other resources to my other businesses. So I'm reviewing information coming from our project management system. So in order to manage all this, of course, we have to have some really good systems. So I review questions coming in from my team regarding designs. I might have to clarify specifications or testing that I have to do, reviews I have to do. And then I'll, work on things like marketing literature, marketing videos, review financials, do payroll for our company. Of course, I've got people who do all the heavy lifting in those areas, but I still have to sign off and review certain things at times. Do a lot of micro reading. I stopped reading full books years ago, even though I still write some books myself, but I find most books to be an inefficient way to learn. So I'm doing a lot of micro reading online. So it's in a lot of things, literally hundreds of different tasks every day. I'll stop there because you're probably getting tired listening to it.
That sounds amazing and very varied as well. I'm curious now, what do you mean by micro reading?
When I used to read traditional conventional books, they'd all be nonfiction because I like reading about real world things that I can apply in my daily life. And so I would read business books, and most business books, they have a couple of really cool ideas, but they're kind of stretched out into 200, 300 pages. And I just find that to be a very inefficient way to learn. So by micro reading, I basically follow my interests, whatever that interest is that day. So if I'm designing a particular game or simulation, there's something I want to learn more about, like, what was the economic performance of the automotive industry in the 1980s? So I'll go and research that for a little bit. And doing that, I might discover something else, another path that I might follow. I might see somebody share something real interesting on LinkedIn. So I'll try to connect and engage and better understand that concept. So it's a lot of these little small, short bursts of knowledge that I'm trying to discover through the day, if that makes sense.
Amazing. Plenty of stuff, plenty of information there. And one of the questions about reading books, maybe towards the end, we'll see what we get to when we get there, right?
For sure.
So, after all this time, Mathew, doing all these things in simulations and games-based learning, we would like to have you, give you this question that we give all our guests, especially at the start, because, it kicks off the conversation in a very nice way. And it's all about failure. I mean, and again, with all this time, all this experience you've had, I'm sure there's been a lot of success, but there's also been those times when you went north and things went south. Can you speak to us about a time when you had what you might call your favorite fail or first attempt in learning?
Certainly lots of failures. I also have this term called micro failures where we as entrepreneurs fail every day, many, many times a day. And ultimately, hopefully that helps us succeed. I've had a lot of business failure challenges, whether it's products that weren't marketed as well as we could have and didn't get as much traction, or I've had my main business almost acquired twice by two public companies that went bankrupt before the deals closed. So I've had lots of those business challenges. In terms of learning, I think one simple example, or learning, developing educational games, one simple example is I designed a board game about 15 years ago almost now. It teaches entrepreneurship and accounting. And I designed the game in such a way that was very unconventional at that time. Because at that time, most board games were very Opoly style, like Monopoly style, where you follow a path, roll some dice, do what it says on the square. And I used a very different approach, a very experiential learning approach. And I designed, wrote the instructions for the game, and I tried to keep them as brief as possible. But what I discovered over time was that people were not following the rules properly. They were misunderstanding how to play the game. And I realized the reason that happened was because of the preconceived notions that my players had of how games work. Well, in a game, I'm supposed to roll the dice, and it's my turn, and I move my pawn, and then it's your turn, and you move your pawn, and that's not how I designed the game. And I realized that the instructions I had written, I was trying to keep them brief, but they were just too brief, and I really need to elaborate. And the easiest solution, of course, was to then develop a video. Although at the time when I first designed the game, having video tutorials was not very common, and YouTube was just starting up at that time. But that's just a simple example of not really thinking through what the potential pitfalls are of your players and the preconceived ideas they may have going into an experience and how you have to overcome that.
Yeah, it's a way of, I've been a lot more into design thinking lately, so that's the kind of thing of, really getting in and sitting next to your user and understanding what is the problem going on there. In this case, it's our player, right? And
Yes.
and that's something that you see more and more in board games nowadays, right? And
Yes.
this happens to me with my wife, especially. She's very smart in that sense. I like to sort of sit down and read the rules and all of that in a board game. She goes like, that sounds very complicated. How about we kick off YouTube and see somebody playing and understand how it goes, right?
Yes. I'm the same. I'll go right to the video before I'll go to the rules. I like to go to the rules if you have to clarify something, but I find the video is easier to follow for me.
So there you go. It's it's about starting where you have to start and seeing what works best for you. And that's a big difference that you have between video games and board games, right? That in video games it's easy to give you an onboarding experience without having to read anything. I mean, there's sort of no need for an alternative. You don't have to go to Twitch and see, how's this guy or this girl playing this game so that I can know how to play it. You just start playing and that's it. You perk out your style or whatever you want. In the case of board games, it's slightly different because you have the pieces, but you don't have to know already how they move. Not necessarily, right?
You're right. With a video game, you have the ability to build progression directly in the experience. So you don't need anybody to review anything prior to playing the game. But with a board game, there has to be some explanation. You can't get around it. And the challenge with board games too is, the more deep you want the experience to be, the more rules you have to create, and the more reading or video watching your players have to do it. It's a real challenge to develop a well-balanced board game.
Exactly. So thanks for that experience. And, especially the way that you went about the solution, I think is key here. And engagers definitely pay attention to that detail. If you want to go back a few minutes and, understand it better, how he realized that this was happening and looked for a solution to solve that exact problem and how, went about it. Then it's about getting creative, of course, and how are you going to solve the problem? But really identifying what the problem is, I would say is 2/3 of the way,
You're
if
right.
not more, right?
Yeah. Clearly understanding what the problem you're trying to solve is the first step in solving it properly.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So Mathew, let's turn that around and actually look at one of those times where you can say it's actually more of a proud moment. One of the things that you said, I have to solve this using games-based learning or one of these solutions, and it came out with a fantastic result. Again, the first try or the nth try, it doesn't matter. We want to sort of be there with you and maybe take some of those lessons of the key, success metrics, so to speak.
Sure. If you don't mind, I think I have a couple of examples I can share there. In terms of the biggest challenges that we face and solve are ones that our users or players will never see. And it happens behind the scenes with our complex educational simulations like business simulations, where we're trying to solve a problem using algorithms. And, the problem is complex because even though we may know what the problem is we want to solve and we know how to solve it, we know as soon as we solve it in that way, it's going to create two other problems, whether it's another technical problem because of the way something is built or a user intuitiveness issue where, hey, yeah, we could do that, but then our users won't really understand that because it's not intuitive. And we run into these types of problems because we develop very, very complex simulations. We run into these problems all the time. And, there's often where we're collaborating, trying to solve this thing. We just stop and say, man, this is really hard. But the biggest ones I'd say most people don't see. I'll give you two other examples, though, that can better illustrate. One is a tech example, and there's a technology problem. And the other one is a design problem. Some years ago, we were commissioned by a very large company who does online high school delivery. And they wanted us to develop virtual science labs, like physics labs, chemistry labs, earth science labs, so that they didn't have to ship a box of chemicals and lab equipment in the mail to their at-home students. And at the time, we were, Flash was the primary technology available, and Flash was good, but it certainly had its limitations.
Back
and
in
our
the
client, if you remember those days, yes, our client had a very specific request when developing these simulations. They said, we don't want simulation, we want verisimilitude. Verisimilitude means realism, as realistic as possible. So when you have a rubber ball on screen that's supposed to have a certain K factor and it bounces on a piece of wood, it needs to bounce in your simulation exactly the same way it would have bounced in the real world. And when you're dealing with Flash, which has its limitations, and we had to use a physics engine, and there was a rudimentary physics engine available that was good, but still had its limitations, trying to recreate the real world, the rubber ball with a K factor bouncing on a piece of wood versus a piece of metal, or the chemical reaction and what it exactly looks like, the colors and everything. Trying to do that is a real challenge. In fact, it's harder than designing a game because with a game, as the game designers, we have a freedom of designing kind of environments that we choose. And the player is in a state of suspension of disbelief where they'll allow you that freedom to break real world physics and real world science because they realize it's a game. So you have that flex. You don't have to kill yourself to get that perfect realism. But when you're developing a virtual science lab for a client who was expecting this, that was a big challenge. And we did solve it. It worked out really great. The client was really happy, but I can tell you that was a significant challenge.
Interesting. And, having a happy client is always good news, right?
Absolutely. The other example I have is a design one. So also many years ago, we were commissioned by another company that was working on international development work in Nigeria to help Nigerian farmers. So there's a lot of farmers in Nigeria. Many of them live on a subsistence level. In other words, they're just barely surviving with their farming. And it was recognized by these development groups that if these farmers could be somewhat trained a little bit better to make slightly better decisions, slightly better business decisions like managing their money, slightly better farming decisions like, if you're farming this type of seed, using 2 boxes of fertilizer is really good. If you use 1 box or 1 bag, you're wasting your money. Little things like that. If they could impart that knowledge to these farmers, they would grow beyond subsistence and actually start making a more beneficial living for them and their families. And they came to us because we're experts in experiential learning, game-based learning. And I had proposed a board game. And it was, and again, this is probably 10, 15 years ago. It was, received with some doubt and skeptic, like, we're going to get Nigerian farmers playing board games? Like, this doesn't really sound like it could work. Of course, as I started explaining more and saying, look, this is not, they're not playing Monopoly here. What we're doing is we're going to recreate a year in their life and the decisions they have to make in that year in this experience. And yes, it's going to use something that looks like a board game, but it's really just facilitates the experiential learning that we're going to create. And so the particular challenge here was not only convincing, the people we were working with that this can work, but we had to design the game in such a way that, no technology, it all had to be all cardboard, paper-based. It had to be robust enough to be thrown in the back of a truck or on a motorcycle, driven into a village and delivered indoors or outdoors. You didn't know whether you'd had 5 farmers show up for the training or 50 farmers, so it had to be fully scalable. The literacy levels would be very varied, right? From people who had very little literacy to higher literacy, and it still had to be a meaningful experience for everybody together. You had different crops being grown in different parts of the country, and it all had to be delivered by an untrained facilitator who was not trained to facilitate. So that was a challenge, right? But the good news is,
How about YouTube?
No YouTube. So the good news was that because we were able to design this experience that recreated the life and build it in such a way that had structure, it could be delivered by an untrained facilitator anywhere in any size group. And we leveraged the knowledge of the participants. So that way we didn't have to create specific content and say, oh, you got to do this for this type of seed or this type of crop. Instead, we used questions and other techniques to have the participants actually share their experience, which was directly in context with what they were learning. So anyway, that was a particular challenge that worked out really well. It ended up being mass produced to train a lot of farmers because the pilot was so successful.
And talking about this, because you've shared already a few experiences of things that you guys have created. I'm sure that by this point, you have some process, series of steps, call it as you will. When you are facing an issue that you want to solve using your techniques, how do you go about it? Like, what's the process? What's the system? How do you do these things?
Yeah, for sure. So I actually wrote about this recently on LinkedIn. I talked about the first 5 things I do when designing an educational experience. And just to give you a kind of quick summary, high level here, the first is I will need to understand the change in behavior that you want from the participants. What skill is it that you want them to achieve? How do you want them to do things differently? So what is that change in behavior? And then I have to understand the learner profile. So, age, cultural representation, any preconceived notions about the way the world works, any intrinsic or extrinsic motivation that they have to learn this skill. So I have to understand the learner profile. I have to understand how much time do we have to deliver this learning for the participant. And the time, by the way, is one of the most misunderstood, I think, elements of designing educational games and simulations. But understanding how much time you have, because you have a limited amount of time to deliver certain learning outcomes. And then the fourth step is understanding kind of the effort, the skills, and the budget. So, yes, this is how much time we have. This is what we need to accomplish. How much effort is this going to take? What kind of skills of the people we need to build this? What kind of budget do we have available, whether it's us internally building it ourselves or for our client to work on this? And then the fifth stage is choosing the actual learning method. So I design everything like videos, board games, card games, activities, massively multiplayer worlds. And so once I understand those first 4 things, the next is, well, what's the best delivery method? Should it be a board game? Should it be a card game? Should it be a software simulation? Should it be a blended game which we've done as well, where you have board games and software simulations kind of driving the results of the game? Should it be something massive? Should it be on a mobile app? So understanding, what's the best learning delivery method. So that's kind of the 5-step approach: change in behavior, learner profile, time, effort / skill / budget, and then the learning method. And then after that, you start building it. So I hope that makes sense.
That makes sense, definitely. And with that information, is there once again, like you go through all of these things, all these different, information collection things, then you have all of this. Now you start designing. Again, do you use some list of game mechanics? Is it just what comes to your mind? Are there any secrets that we can know about how you do this?
I'm not sure if there's secrets, but just a lot of experience, thinking about these things and building them over time. So, you kind of have to think about what is the environment you want to put the player in. So let's say we decide it's going to be a board game or a card game or software simulation or something like that. What is the environment? What are the things we want the person to do that we feel will achieve the learning objective? And do they have to do it on a repetitive basis, like some type of rote experience as well? So it's really trying to understand what are those activities, what is the context. And so we tend to design things that are based on real world. So if I want to teach you how to run a business, I'm going to teach you how to run a real business, like a Starbucks, a McDonald's, and that kind of actual business. I'm not going to put you in space selling, space goggles to aliens. I could do that, and that could still be fun. In some cases, that might make sense. But we tend to lean more towards realism rather than using metaphors. Although, again, I totally acknowledge metaphors can be great, and I have used metaphors In fact, I'm working on a game right now where I'm trying to decide what that metaphor is. It's a kind of a board game where you chase people around. So should it be car chase? Should it be a chase in space? Should it be a Western? So we kind of think about what those metaphors or what that realism should be and how well that would resonate with the participants and how well it would achieve that objective. So I think that's a big part of the design process. And then once you figure that out, then you kind of have to start building it. So you start storyboarding it. I like to sketch things out on paper or on my tablet. I have a remarkable tablet, which I really like sketching things out on and just working through things in my mind. And then eventually you get to a more formal storyboard and a specification that your team can build from.
Sounds amazing. A lot of key insights there. Thanks for that, Matthew. Definitely lots of, the experience that you've gained throughout the years on how to do these things. And sometimes, for experts like yourself who's been doing this for a long time, it's like, yeah, but that's that's kind of obvious sometimes. And it's not. You'll see, from and I'm sure you have already seen from when other people hear this and say, oh, this here and that there. It's like, yeah, there's a lot of insights to be gained. And that's why we talk to and we listen to experts and people who've been doing this, especially if there's been a good level of success, like in your case, Matthew. And we definitely have to, pay good attention, lend our ears and say, okay, let me see what's up here. What can I gain in the best of senses out of this experience from another person? And that's exactly what we're doing here once again. Just a quick break before we continue. Are you enjoying this podcast? If you're listening through a podcasting app, please subscribe and rate us on the app. This will be of great help to reach more engagers so we can change the world together through gamification. So Matthew, again, with all of that experience that you've been offering us today, is there some form of, I don't know, I don't like to call it a silver bullet, but maybe a best practice? One of those things that you say, well, you think about your solution this way or that way, or you do this thing or that thing, your solution will be, I don't know if, the best one ever, but at least better than it would be if you don't consider it.
It's interesting. I thought about writing a book over the years about how to design games and simulations, particularly educational products. So that's kind of my focus. And I never did it because it's just too complicated. And I think what you're doing with your podcast, I have a newsletter that I'm trying to do something similar, is actually sharing these experiences and design approaches is actually a better way to do it because there is no perfect path to designing these things. A lot of it comes from, learning from others, but then also doing yourself. So a couple of things that I've noticed in terms of making things better, game-based solutions, is I think time. I mentioned this a little bit earlier, that time is such an important factor in educational products because when somebody's adopting an educational brand, you're usually doing it with a facilitator or trainer. Obviously, there's self-directed products as well and experiences, but even those have a time constraint. So you have to achieve a certain learning objective within a period of time. Unlike an entertainment game, whereas when I design an entertainment game, my objective is to get you playing as much as I can. Right? I want you to have as much fun as possible, and I want you to keep playing it. Time is not an issue, other than I want you to play more, not less. Education's the opposite. So if you're trying to get a high school teacher or a university professor to adopt your resource in their curriculum, they're going to say, look, my course is 40 hours and I got 10 hours that I could use your resource for, or 5 hours or 2 hours. And your resource has to achieve a specific meaningful objective within that time frame, because otherwise they can't use it because they've got 100 other things that they have to accomplish in their job. And I find that that's where a lot of educational products fall down, is that they either take too long and are unrealistic in their time requirements, or they don't accomplish enough learning outcomes. So if I'm a trainer or instructor and I have 100 learning outcomes I have to achieve with my participants, but your product is only achieving 2 of them or 3 of them, how can I justify using it? As great as your product might be, as amazing as my participants may love your product, if I can only accomplish 3 out of the 100, how am I going to make this work? So I think time is one of those big ones. Another one is, and I actually just wrote about this in my newsletter, is rote learning. So rote learning means repetition. And we all learn, the alphabet and mathematical addition, subtraction, multiplication using rote learning. And rote learning is seen negatively in education in a lot of ways, but I believe it's a very powerful tool when it's used well. And entertainment games use rote learning well because, we talked about progression earlier. You start with minimum challenge in your progression. and you gain some skills, and then the game throws something harder at you. Not too hard, hard enough that you're probably going to fail the first few times, but not too hard that's going to overwhelm you. And you get better and you accomplish that and you keep moving forward. And you're doing a lot of that through rote learning. Now in games, sometimes it's called grinding, and grinding is not great. So there's kind of this fine line between learning something meaningful and then just grinding for the sake of grinding. But I find rote learning is incredibly important. Even if you look at a lot of corporate environments where they use role playing, for sales tactics or marketing tactics or HR learning, they'll do a couple of role playing exercises and they're really great. But if you're only doing a couple of these things, it's not building your muscle memory in your brain. So you're never going to remember it when you need to remember it. And rote learning helps build that muscle memory in our brain. I don't think it's used effectively enough in a lot of educational products. And then the last thing I'll mention is better graphics. We could always create better graphics in educational products. Challenge is budget. So better use of time, rote learning, and better graphics, I think, are the three things that I would focus on.
That's amazing. 3 recommendations in one. So there you go, engagers. Take out your notepad and write those down. Rote learning is something that I hadn't seen that way, but I love the way that you put it as well. So thanks for that, Mathew. And again, in the region or the realm of recommendations, and this might be a difficult one because of our earlier conversation, is there a book that you would recommend the engagers to read, perhaps to get better at this? And again, it could be a book directly explaining, games-based learning, or something to get inspiration from, whatever that could be. Up to you, of course.
Sure. I don't know of a book that captures everything that would help, but that's why I actually started a newsletter recently, which is accessible from my website and on LinkedIn, where I'm sharing each of these individual experiences that I've gone through over the last 20 years building products and trying to illustrate what I was thinking, how I did it, to help others who may be building educational resources. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to build a game or simulation, but even if you're just working in the education industry and you're creating educational resource, my hope is that my newsletter, some issue of that newsletter, and everything's pretty short, you can read it all within a few minutes, just gives you some idea or some inspiration. I saw this mechanic used here, and maybe I can use it in the way I do. So I think things that are provided in more bite-sized suggestions, like a newsletter, like your podcast, I think that's a much more effective way to kind of gain this experience.
Amazing. So for reading, we have the newsletter of Mathew. I'll link that on the show notes. Definitely engagers, if you want to look for that, type Mathew. You'll probably find a couple more Mathews from past guests, but you'll only find one, Georghiou?
Georghiou, that's right.
Georghiou, there you go. And you'll definitely find him there. This should be episode 251 or something along those lines. We'll see at the end, but you'll be able to find it there. And you'll find all of the notes, all of the links that you have there. You'll find to his website, to the newsletter on his website, and so on. So Mathew, keeping up with those recommendations, is there somebody like listening to these questions? Would you say like there's somebody that came to your mind and saying, this person might be interesting, or I'd like to hear this person answering these questions on Professor Game?
You know what I'd like to see, Rob, is I'd like to see more interviews of educators who decided to use an educational game or simulation and had an aha moment with their students where they're like, wow, this works. Because a lot of us talking about it, I think will convince some people that, this is a transformative experience. But hearing from other peers who've already done it and telling you how easy it was to do it, hopefully, they'll say it was easy integration. That's where I'd love to hear more of these. And because I also like to help understand how they think, right? Like, why did you choose to use a simulation for the first time? What made you not do it? The more I can understand how an educator decides to use a game, that's would be super powerful for me.
Sounds amazing. And if you have any ideas of somebody that has had one of those with one of your games, perhaps now or in the future, just let us know.
Oh, awesome. I do, and I'm happy to do so.
Fantastic. So Mathew, finishing or perhaps wrapping up with the kind of recommendations and things that people would like to know. Oh, well, actually, let's go for your superpower first. What would you say is your superpower, that thing that you do better than most other people, especially in this realm, of course?
I think it's being able to visualize the entire solution that has to be built from end to end, because I started my background is in programming, engineering. So I know how everything is built, but I'm also very interested in design, and I have a design business as well. And so I understand how the design and the graphics are built. So I understand every element of it, from the algorithm development to the programming to the graphic design to the educational outcomes that we have to achieve, that I'm able to design things really, really quickly. And I'm able to see the pitfalls of where the risks are of building something, where we can cut corners. So if the budget is tight, here's where we can cut a corner without actually compromising the outcome of the learning objective. So I think it's that ability to see everything and ability to make decisions really, really quickly. Whereas in many other instances where I've worked on other products with other companies and things like that, there's constant meetings and, everybody kind of has their own expertise and everybody's trying to convince everybody else of what to do, and things take forever and cost, 5 times more than they should cost. And I think that's really my superpower.
Amazing. Very good superpower to have, definitely. And now for the difficult question. What would you say, Mathew, is your favorite game?
Yeah, that's a tough one. In terms of broadly games, it's actually the sport of basketball, I have to say, even though that's not quite the kind of games we're talking about. But that's the one thing I've been playing all my life and helped pay my way through school. So I definitely think basketball. But if I look at other types of games, I don't have a favorite one, but I can kind of give you some ones that I remember fondly or give me some inspiration, if that makes sense.
Before you get into that, which definitely welcome, basketball is a game, and I've had this as well. Some clients say, the things I don't like games, and you look at you're in their office and you see they have, some basketball things or some football things. Like, oh, really? But do you like football or basketball? Oh, yeah, of course I love it. So you like the game of football, the game of, oh, okay, now I see where you're getting.
Yes, you're exactly right. Yes.
Go ahead.
Yeah, sure. So, in terms of nostalgia, Space Invaders is my nostalgia game. I had the first edition on my Atari way back when, and then, when they hit the arcades, that would be the kind of first one. So that's a nostalgia one for me. These days, games like Zelda, play FIFA soccer. I really like that. My son and I play that a lot, but I really appreciate the depth of something like Zelda. In word games, Wordle, I was hooked on Wordle there for a month or two, just like the rest of the world was hooked on it. VR, I've got a Quest, the original Quest VR, games like Super Hot, I think was pretty interesting and unique. Drop Dead is kind of a zombie shooter game that I've played a bit. Beat Saber was a music game that I think is pretty popular. In terms of board games, I like Settlers of Catan. I haven't played in a long time, but I liked that it kind of ushered in a new way of thinking about board games, back in early 2000s. So I like the idea of Settlers and just opening up the minds of how board games could work. I like Love Letters, if you've heard of Love Letters, because of I like the simplicity of like a game that has 15 cards. So I think it's 15 or 16 cards, and that's it. So I like that simplicity, especially when I have kids. And one of my kids has special needs, so we can't play 2 games that are too complex. So I like games that you can just pick up and play right away really easily. So Love Letters kind of meets that simplicity. I like Exploding Kittens. My son also loves Exploding Kittens. Can't get enough of it. I like the creativity of it, the flavor that's on the cards and just the concept of exploding. I think is really interesting. Stop Thief is a game that I played as a kid and has been remade over the past couple of years. That's pretty interesting. I'm working on a game that I think might end up being my favorite, though. It's a city building game. And it's got this really unique mechanic where it's both a game and a puzzle, like a physical puzzle, building a city. And I think that's got potential. I'm still in the kind of halfway stages of building it. I hopefully have my first prototype in the next few weeks, but I think that one's got some interesting potential for me.
Amazing. If you can share something that we can look at or in the future, once you have it outside and we can see it, that would be amazing.
Yeah.
Fantastic. So Mathew, thank you so much for being with us today. I don't know if you have any sort of final words for the engagers, any final piece of advice. If not, after that, give us where we can find out more about you, about the work that you're doing, you and your company, before, of course, we say that it's game over.
Awesome. Well, my advice is to play more games. Don't have to be complex games. It could just be simple games, because playing them gives you these aha moments of different mechanics. You can go to Wikipedia and get a list of game mechanics, but they're not really going to be mean a lot to you unless you've experienced them yourself. And if you're an educator listening to this, my advice is play some yourself, but you don't actually have to be a gamer to have your students benefit from gaming. You don't have to know anything about gaming. If you pick the right products that are designed for use in that type of environment, you'll have an amazing transformative experience. And I think that's beneficial for everyone. But in terms of me and how to reach me, my website, Georghiou.com, which is Georghiou.com. You can also find me on LinkedIn, Mathew Georghiou, and happy to connect with anyone who's in this space.
Amazing, amazing. Thank you so much again for sharing your experience, your insights, your knowledge, and all of the above with the engagers. However, as you know, engagers, and as you know now, Mathew, for now, and at least for today, it is time to say that it's game over. Engagers, it is fantastic to have you around, and thank you for listening to the Professor Game podcast. And if you want more interviews with incredible guests like Mathew, then go to professorgame.com/subscribe and get started on our email list for free. We will be in contact and you'll be the first to know of any opportunities that we might have for you. And remember, before you go on to your next mission, remember to follow, subscribe, whatever that looks like on your favorite podcast app. Do it because it's for free, and listen to the next episode of Professor Game. See you there.